Welcome, everyone. Today, this is a webinar focused on research with justice-involved populations, understanding OHRP Subpart C regulations and protections. I'm Tisha Wiley. I am the Chief of the Services Research Branch here at NIDA. And I want to thank my colleagues at Addiction Policy Forum who have helped us manage the webinar today. But I'm delighted today to be joined by Julia Gorey, who will be our featured speaker. And before I introduce Ms. Gorey, I just want to give a little context for why we're hosting this webinar. I've led our justice research here at NIDA for many years, and we've funded a lot of great research, and much of that research often goes to Julia to review and approve. And over the years, we've noticed there's often confusion about what is and is not allowable, and confusion about understanding these regulations and what they apply to. And a couple months ago, that came up in the context of a discussion at a National Academies meeting, and we thought that this might be a great time to address some of that confusion and sort of lay out the policies. And there's no one better to do that than Julia, so we've invited her to join us. Just context, we are this seminar is being presented as part of the seminar series that we do as part of the Justice Community Opioid Innovation Network, or JCOIN. We are wrapping up the first phase of JCOIN, and this summer we'll be releasing RFAs for the second phase of JCOIN. But we also fund lots of investigator-initiated research, and this is relevant across that. And we have many colleagues at other parts of the NIH or within NIDA that often get confused about where the regulations apply. So we're hopeful that today's webinar will answer some of those questions. And if there's, we will have time for a Q&A at the end where you can ask any clarifying questions. So with that, I'm going to introduce Julia Gorey. Ms. Gorey is a policy analyst in the Division of Policy and Assurances at the Office of Human Research Protections at the Department of Health and Human Services. She serves as the lead staff for 45 CFR 46 Part C Policy and Process Matters. And in addition to assisting with the formulation of OHRP policy, Ms. Gorey serves as the Executive Director for the Secretary's Advisory Committee on Human Resource Protections. The mission of that group is to provide expert advice and recommendations to the Secretary for the conduct of research involving human subjects. And I just want to say, Julia has been a tremendous colleague and a wonderful resource for me pretty much the entirety of my career here at NIDA, and has just been wonderfully reasonable and great to work with. So I hope you'll all learn a lot from her. And I do want to acknowledge she also, prior to going to OHRP, worked at the NIH, serving as the Radiation Safety Officer of the NIH Neuroscience Center at St. Elizabeth's and manager of the Single Positron Emission Computerized Tomography Laboratory. That's a long title. For the Clinical Brain Disorders Branch at NIMH. So I'm really delighted to have her here today to share her expertise with us. So thank you. So Julia, the stage is all yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Tisha. I appreciate that. And I'm going to share my slides. Thank you, everyone. And I am Julia Gorey from OHRP. It's a delight to be here. And this talk, I'm hoping to aim at a little bit more than an introductory level to be able to provide some examples and some pointers for planning Subpart C research. So the usual disclaimer that my opinions are those of my own and not of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Now, I want to start out by just a few words about Subpart C, and I'm not going to be doing a deep dive here onto the history of the subpart. I do want to point out that the subpart was published actually in 1978, which is very early. It's well before the codification of the common rule. It's before Subpart D, which came along in 1984, and Subpart B, which came along in 2001. So this was very early out of the gate and is a direct result of the National Commission's report on research involving prisoners, which was published in 1976. And that report really focused on coercion and informed consent on research involving prisoners. So let's start out with going over just some major distinguishing points regarding Subpart C research. The first, as you probably all know, is that if you're reviewing Subpart C, the IRB has to have a prisoner representative. And this person has to be a full-time voting member of the board. They can't be an alternate. OHRP recommends that this person be someone who has the expertise and background to serve in that capacity, but recognize that whoever the prisoner representative is going to depend largely on the portfolio of Subpart C at your institution. And so who you may have as a prisoner representative may differ markedly than from other institutions. Secondly, the emergency waiver of informed consent is not permitted for Subpart C research. It's simply wholly not permitted. So third, whenever Subpart C is being reviewed, the IRB has to review the 305 criteria that speak to consent, risk, and coercion considerations. That's really the main duty of the IRB regarding Subpart C, in addition to also ensuring that the research fits into one of 5 permissible categories. Now, usually people hear about 4 permissible categories, but there is a very narrow 5th category for epidemiologic research. We're not going to be talking about that category here today. Now, if the study is HHS funded, the institution needs to submit a certification request and actually receive an authorization letter back before starting the research involving prisoners. And I've included the link for that certification request. I want to point out that Subpart C is very temporal. And by that, I mean it's triggered anytime there are research interactions or interventions with a prisoner. That means, however, that if someone is incarcerated for only a very short time, the subpart might not be triggered at all. For example, if you have someone who's been brought up for misdemeanor charges, perhaps a drug charge, and they're going to be in jail for a relatively short period of time, a day or two, if all the research interactions occur either before they're incarcerated or after they're incarcerated, Subpart C is never triggered and there's no need to do a certification request. And lastly, I want to point out that the application of the exemptions is prohibited under the Revised Common Rule, except for research that only incidentally includes prisoners. Okay, this is a very narrow window of exemption. Just a reminder, under the old Common Rule, the exemptions were not permitted with Subpart C at all. All right, so any Subpart C talk has to focus on the definition of a prisoner. It's just central to everything, so let's go ahead and go through it. A prisoner means any individual involuntarily confined or detained in a penal institution. The regulation goes on to cite those who are sentenced under a criminal or civil statute, individuals detained in other facilities by virtues of statutes or commitment procedures, which are alternatives to incarceration, and individuals detained pending arraignment, trial, or sentencing. Now, please note I've bolded the word detained because, as here in that definition, detained is mentioned 3 times, and therefore it becomes a real touchstone for OHRP when we have to make close call determinations as to whether or not someone should be treated as a prisoner for purposes of Subpart C. I also want to point out our prisoner FAQs there at the bottom, which I think are well done. They're very user-friendly, and they go into more detail regarding the definition of a prisoner. So the take-home message is to understand that OHRP's Subpart C definition of a prisoner expands the traditional notion of an incarcerated person. And as such, Subpart C certifications can come from and include a wide swath of circumstances. They certainly can include juvenile detention, and I would say 20% perhaps of the certifications that I see involve some sort of juvenile detention, whether it's integration back into the community or something, a drug program going on in that center itself. It's very common. But it's also common to see certifications that involve subjects with diminished mental capacity, HIV/AIDS, substance abuse, or circumstances such as homelessness. These are circumstances that have a very reciprocal relationship with the justice system. So it's reasonable to anticipate in certain studies that at some point, if not at recruitment, at some point down the line, some of those subjects are going to become incarcerated and require a Subpart C approval. So, who's not a Subpart C prisoner? Sometimes it's easier to look at it this way. Who's not a Subpart C prisoner? You're not a prisoner if you've been court adjudicated to attend non residential treatment programs as alternatives to incarceration while living in the community. And that's important. So, if someone is up on a drug charge and the judge says that they need to attend drug treatment, but they're allowed to live in the community while they do so. And they just have to show up to this non residential program several days a week. Well, there's no detention, right? There's no detention, and therefore they're not considered prisoners under Subpart C. By the same token, if someone voluntarily enters treatment, they're not a prisoner. If they've been civilly committed due to a danger to themselves or others, not a prisoner. If they've been released from prison to a halfway house or a step-down facility, the terms change depending on jurisdiction and location. But if the subject is being released to some sort of we'll call it a step-down facility, where there is no judicial consequence to them simply walking away, then they're not a prisoner. Again, there's no detention. If you have a study that's simply looking at arrests, for example, just the process of being handcuffed does not make you a prisoner under Subpart C. Now, electronic monitoring is a bit more of a gray line. It's generally not considered a prisoner status, but it usually comes down to a discussion of whether you're really trying to detain that person, as in house arrest, for example, or whether you're simply trying to monitor their whereabouts. Don't leave town, don't leave this locality. So it will come down to a discussion of that nature. And I recommend, if you are experiencing protocols that involve electronic monitoring, to give OHRP a call. Okay, so now we get to what is really the heart of the Subpart C protections. The first, of course, is that the IRB has to find a permissible category for the research. But all of these criteria, and there are 7 of them, they go to issues such as risk or coercion or recruitment or informed consent considerations. So the IRB has to satisfy all of these criteria for the research study. Okay. Now, often it may occur that all of these criteria are not pertinent to the particular study that's being reviewed. For example, number 7, adequate provision has been made for follow-up care. If there is no follow-up care, then obviously 7 is not going to apply. But in that case, the reviewers should be very careful to note NA, it doesn't apply, rather than simply leaving the impression potentially that consideration just wasn't weighed by the IRB. Okay, so now we're going to get to the categories. There are 4 categories, and we're going to start, of course, with category 1, a study of possible causes, effects, and processes of incarceration and of criminal behavior. Now, category 1 is a very large category. We see a lot of drug research here because drug use, substance abuse is considered a possible cause of incarceration and criminal behavior. There's a lot of social behavioral work involving prisoners, involving reintegration into the community that will fall under category 1. So very large category. Category 2 is much more narrow. It's a study of prisoners as prisons as institutional structures, or prisoners as incarcerated persons. Okay, much more of a narrow focus. But both of these are no more than minimal risk categories. Okay, can permit no more than minimal risk. And then we get to category 3, which is research on studies particularly affecting prisoners as a class. As a class. And the language in category 3 goes on to reference, for example, hepatitis studies or vaccine trials. It's a bit of a mixed bag in category 3. It's very broad and often overlaps with the other categories. There is no risk ceiling in category 3, but category 3 necessarily requires a secretarial consultation. And therefore, if a study comes in that's been categorized by the IRB as a category 3, and OHRP feels it might more appropriately live in category 1 or 2, OHRP will recategorize the study rather than pursuing a secretarial consultation. And we're going to talk more about that in just a minute. That's categories 1, 2, and 3. And now we're going to talk about category 4. And we're really going to dwell with category 4 for a bit because it's the category that tends to cause the most confusion for people. So category 4, research on practices, both innovative and accepted, which have the intent and reasonable probability of improving the health or well-being of the subject. Okay, so let's stop there. Let's stop there. So the study has to have some prospect, right? Some intent and reasonable probability of improving the health or well-being of the subject. That's not the prison population writ large. It's not the population you're looking at. It's the subject. It's an individualized benefit, okay? So then, okay, now we'll go on. It's usually the second sentence that causes problems. In cases in which those studies require assignment of prisoners in a manner consistent with protocols approved by the IRB to control groups which may not benefit from the research, the study can proceed only after a secretarial consultation. So there's no risk ceiling to category 4, but that second sentence can cause a lot of confusion, and we will try and unpack that. So the OHRP interpretation of a control group is standard of care, services as usual, or placebo. Okay, standard of care, services as usual, or placebo. So what this means is that if a study is greater than minimal risk, randomization of prisoners to a control group, which may not benefit from the research, is going to require a secretarial consultation. Okay. However, randomization of prisoners to 2 or more active arms can be approved without a secretarial consultation. Now, a consultation doesn't mean it can't be done. It doesn't mean it can't be done. What exactly is this beast that we keep referring to? A secretarial consultation. Well, the process is similar to that of a 407 review under Subpart D. And I'd encourage you to look at the draft guidance from FDA and OHRP that really outlines that process for 407s, but this would be a very similar process. So OHRP would first request the complete protocol, all consent forms, IRB minutes, any other informative documentation. We're going to review that, ensure the study is in our scope, and those materials will be placed in a docket, a public docket for public comment after appropriate retractions, okay? Then a panel of experts is going to be selected, typically 5 to 10 experts pertinent to the field. They're going to review those materials. They're going to be asked to each write their own independent recommendation regarding the study. Then a public meeting is scheduled. It's held to discuss the proposed research. We're going to hear from many stakeholders at this meeting. We're going to hear from the grantor and the grantee, the community representatives, other members of the public. All of those materials, all of the documentation from that meeting is again going to be placed in this public docket along with the recommendations that have been made by those selected experts. Then OHRP is going to develop an opinion for the Assistant Secretary of Health, which may include changes to the research protocol. The Assistant Secretary then, on behalf of the Secretary, issues a final determination as to whether or not the research can proceed, and if so, what changes may be required. So what's the timeline for all of that to happen? Well, it's reasonable to expect that that's going to take at least 6 to 9 months. I think that's probably a conservative estimate, but a fair estimate, 6 to 9 months. So understanding that that time frame is likely burdensome for institutions as well as for federal agencies, and is not something that should be undertaken lightly. I then want to go over some um, things that could be kept in mind in order to not trigger this consultation. Your study is not going to trigger a secretarial consultation if um, prisoners are not randomized to a placebo, standard of care, or services as usual arm. Okay, prisoners are not randomized to these standard of care arms. Now, keep in mind, and you'll see in some examples, that prisoners can be randomized to a standard of care plus arm if the arm is offering something else in addition to that standard of care. Okay, next. Also, if the subjects become prisoners only after enrollment, because a subsequently incarcerated situation, because in this case, there's been no assignment of a prisoner to the control group. That assignment occurred while the subject wasn't a prisoner. Next. If the subjects were prisoners, but are recruited after release, even immediately after release, the subjects aren't prisoners, Subpart C isn't triggered, there's no secretarial consultation needed. Next. Sometimes if the study is minimal risk and satisfies the language of categories 1 or 2, a category 4 study may be able to be moved to a category 1 or category 2. So that's another way. Next. So now what I want to do is actually look at some examples and try and drive home these points. So this is our first example. Office-based methadone versus buprenorphine to address retention and medication for opioid use disorder treatment, a randomized, pragmatic, hybrid effectiveness implementation trial. Okay, so in essence, this is a randomized trial comparing office-based methadone and office-based buprenorphine. So take a moment, read this, read the whole slide, and tell me, can this study be approved and why? So we'll give it just a couple seconds. Okay. I don't know if I can hear from anybody in the audience, but what really is determinative in this study is that second paragraph. Okay, the second paragraph that says that individuals who are currently in jail, prison, or other overnight facilities will not be recruited. In fact, it was an exclusion criteria for this study. This study's being certified for potential follow-up assessments in case the subjects become incarcerated. So the study is approvable under category 4. Okay, a comparative effectiveness trial of sublingual versus extended release buprenorphine with individuals leaving a carceral setting. It's a randomized controlled trial of extended release buprenorphine and sublingual buprenorphine in a large metropolitan jail. So again, same thing. We'll give it a few seconds, read this through, and I want you to think whether or not this could be approved under Category 4 and why? Okay. Well, this study can be approved because this is an example of standard of care plus, right? In this situation, if you look at the sublingual buprenorphine, and I hope I'm saying those words correctly, as the standard of care, look at everything else that both arms in the study are receiving. Okay, they're receiving 6 months of treatment. They're receiving a safety visit. They're receiving long-term follow-up at 12 months. They're receiving all of this in addition to the what you would call the standard of care, and therefore the study can be approved. Okay, next. Long-acting injectable antiretroviral treatment to improve HIV treatment among justice-involved persons being released to the community. Okay. This is a fairly simple Category 4 study because it's a single arm study. There's no assignment that's going on between arms, so it's easily approvable. Next. Unlocking access to infectious disease testing and vaccination in jails. Stakeholder engagement. I wanted to show this to you because it's an example, as I mentioned earlier, of a study that came in categorized as Category 3. Now, recall that Category 3 is necessarily going to trigger a secretarial level consultation. And I assume that the IRB perhaps felt that it was a Category 3 because of disease testing and vaccination in jails. It would perhaps be considered to be a study of prisons and prisoners as a class. But the study also overlaps with Category 2. And so OHRP did exactly that. Next, Brendan, if you could put it up, just noting OHRP recategorized this from 3 to 2. Next. Lastly, I wanted to just note a very typical Category 2 study assessing needs and advancing dignity conserving care for hospitalized incarcerated older adults, a cohort study, and this is a retrospective chart review. Okay, a very common Subpart C study. Next. All right, I want to switch gears a little bit to talk about confidentiality and privacy considerations in jail. Of course, the regulatory site that's going to be pertinent is 46111A7 that says when appropriate, there are adequate provisions to protect privacy and of subjects and the confidentiality of data. But this can be particularly hard when you have subjects in a jail or prison who might be experiencing two-person jail cells or open cell blocks, as well as open showers. There's really no reasonable expectation of privacy in a jail. So the IRB needs to really scrutinize the particular context of a study and assess how it relates to the risk. Next. So a few notes on this topic. I think everyone accepts now that they should utilize encrypted laptops for surveys rather than oral interviews and use all methods to prevent eavesdropping. I just can't emphasize how important that is. I've had someone who's an inmate and is on an IRB tell me that even if a guard isn't stationed at the door, you should always assume that all rooms are being recorded or have listening devices. The IRB should, of course, limit access to identifiable data, be aware of mandatory reporting requirements. But I really want to focus here on educating the research staff about the particular context, particularly of a brick and mortar jail or prison. And there are several possible issues that can arise here, and some examples that I wanted to share with you that I've been told over the years. One is the risks that can be caused by walking into a room at a jail or a prison with recruitment materials. Possibly, you're getting ready to try and get informed consent from some subjects, and you ask them if they can read. Hey, can you guys read? I wanted to share with you these materials. What's the problem with that in a jail or prison context? Well, the problem that I've been told is that nobody in a jail or prison wants to admit that they can't read. Nobody wants to admit that. It's a sign of weakness and can start to establish a power differential between the inmates. So IRBs need to be aware of that and need to scrutinize other ways that they can communicate information and try and assess whether or not subjects can read rather than asking that question in a group environment. Another thing to look out for is the prison administration controlling communications to prisoners. So if you see a study where recruitment information is being disseminated by the prison staff, that can be a problem because the prison staff can, in effect, cherry pick who they want to report back has expressed interest in the study. Okay, something to be aware of that I've been told on multiple occasions is a problem. And then lastly, I just want to point out the risks that can be posed by questions about follow-up contacts. Next. And I just wanted to share what's typical locator form language. Following the consent, a study team member will complete a locator form. The locator form obtains information on the living and housing plans of participants once released, as well as their prior places of residence. Contact information of relatives and friends will be gathered, locations of hangout spots, places of employment, and a basic physical description are also documented. This form will be kept in study files. Well, this locator form can really be a source of great risk, particularly for those relatives and friends, particularly, well, often I should say, female relatives and friends who this information is being gathered from. It may well be the case that the person that you're trying to locate does not want to be located. And so knowing that these relatives and friends have that information that could point someone to the subject could cast them in the role of a stool pigeon and pose risks that hadn't originally been considered. Next. Okay, I also want to touch on undue influence and coercion for a prisoner population. The regulatory site here is 116A2, which says informed consent can only be sought under circumstances that minimize coercion and undue influence. And I want to ask you to consider what this might look like for a prisoner population. It certainly might look like additional family time, right? If a study offers additional visitation time, that might be an issue of undue influence. Next, and next, Brandon, you could do it twice. Money, of course, is always a concern. Access to medical care, if the study is the only way that the inmate could get that care, that could be an issue of undue influence or coercion. But I'm sure we can also think of many other examples of influence or coercion in a prison context. It might be access to cigarettes, it might be access to phone cards, given that phone usage in prisons is a very big deal. For other populations, homeless populations, it might simply be access to heat. It might be relief from boredom. Next. I want to remind everyone that one of those 305 criteria speaks particularly to coercion and undue influence. It says any possible advantages accruing to the prisoner population through his or her participation in the research are not of such a magnitude that his or her ability to weigh the risks of the research against the value of these advantages in the choice of the prison is impaired. Next. There are particular concerns about payment and undue influence. Um, Payment, particularly in a jail or a prison, leads to concerns about exploitation of prisoners as a class, concerns about how that payment is going to be advertised, concerns about payment-induced deception, meaning whether subjects are going to lie about eligibility criteria in order to get into a certain study. There's completion bonuses, which are always fraught with ethical issues, and there may be taxation issues. So, particularly in the context of Subpart C, these concerns can often lead to a sort of payment conservatism, I'll say, the notion that it's better to be safe than sorry. But I want to counter that by saying that participants may be exploited if they receive inadequate payment for their contributions to research. I also want to note that in Subpart C populations, it's possible that not everybody's going to have a Social Security number. And if you don't have a Social Security number, you can't be paid. Not wanting or not having or not wanting to share your Social Security number could affect not only your ability to receive payment, but also the representativeness of your study. Payments can also affect eligibility for benefit programs such as food stamps. So this possibility, if payment is of a magnitude that could be impacted, that possibility should be noted in consent forms. Next. Now, a few more words about the IRB membership for Subpart C review and those requirements. We noted before that the membership has to have at least one prisoner representative. I want to also point out another criteria, which is that a majority of the board, exclusive of prisoner members, shall have no association with the prison involved apart from their membership on the board. So we recently got an interesting question, and it says it basically said our IRB oversees research at 10 different state hospitals, and patients may be coming from multiple regions. So, should we replace prison with state hospital or state hospital system? Or does this refer to strictly the prison a state hospital patient may be associated with? The concern is whether we need to limit our IRB membership associations with the state hospital system or agency that oversees that hospital. Next. Well, I want to point out that associated in 304 is very similar to affiliated in 107C in terms of what it's trying to do. The regulation is really striving to avoid IRB members who may have financial ties or bias or influence on a particular study. And OHRP does have guidance on affiliated, what it means to have an affiliation, and I offer that, although we do not have any guidance or definition for what it means to be associated. I just, again, want to emphasize that OHRP considers them to be very similar, and ultimately, we would believe that the institution itself is in the best position to judge the relevant authorities that these given entities may have over an institution and whether potential IRB members should be excluded based on those considerations. So OHRP is going to turn this back to the institution to judge where those concentric circles become a concern for the IRB. Now, just a few words about the actual mechanics of the Subpart C certification. We do have a new online system. If you have bookmarked the old submission form from several years ago, I would encourage you to update your bookmark. We do have this new submission system. It's been in place for about a year. The institution doing the submission would go on. They would submit the protocol, the consent forms, any other IRB required information. Once that submission is done, you will get back an acknowledgement that will have the case number of the study. So you'll be able to track the submission as it does go through the process and is approved. I particularly want to point out fields that are relevant for single IRB. So the form does ask for the name of the reviewing IRB and the names of institutions that are relying on that IRB. For example, then, if you are the single IRB reviewing 2 sites and you certify, and then a year later, you are going to be the IRB of record for a third site, you would need to submit a new certification form, but you can reference the case number from the original form, which will expedite the handling and the return of that authorization letter. Finally, in closing, I want to offer these resources, the prisoner FAQs, again, the link for certification submission, and the 2003 OHRP prisoner research guidance.